in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong did well in the period before 1997 because it was smart, because it was clever, because it was free, because it could get on with it, because it was with the British and so on. Now, I think that for the great part, this is a serious misinterpretation of history. Hong Kong did well between the late 1970s and the handover in 1997 because it got lucky. What do I mean by that? It got lucky because China in 1978 started to open up bit by bit, step by step. It didn't open up fully until after the WTO agreement in 2001. So while it was still opening up in a piecemeal fashion, Hong Kong could take on some of the functions that otherwise China would have done. It would have like the front office in some senses for China. And so Hong Kong was the beneficiary of being able to do these things. One of these things, of course, was that if you were a Western firm, a European firm, an American firm, a Japanese firm, and a Korean firm, and you wanted to access the Chinese market, the easiest stopping point initially was to do it from Hong Kong. So it wasn't that they were very smart, it was that they got lucky. They got lucky not because of the British, they got lucky because of China and the role that China was performing. Now, of course, after WTO, then China increasingly, I mean, if you wanted to open up in the Chinese market, why would you go to Hong Kong? It became irrelevant. If you want to open up in the Chinese market, go to Shanghai, or go to Beijing, or go to Guangzhou, or go to Shenzhen, wherever you wanted to go. But you wouldn't, by and large, choose to stay in Hong Kong. So the raison d'etre, the cause of Hong Kong's relative success in that period, disappeared. And Hong Kong had to find a new role in the period after 1997. So it wasn't China's fault that this happened. This was a change of circumstances in the relationship between China and Hong Kong. Now, another reason that the period since 1997 has been criticised, particularly by the British, the former governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, would say, China's not being true to democracy and so on. Now, this, in my view, this is British hypocrisy. Britain ran Hong Kong for 155 years. And I'll tell you something, there was never a semblance of democracy. Did they ever introduce universal suffrage? Did they ever talk about universal suffrage? Not a word of it until after the handover agreement, and then with Chinese rule looming, then it became essential that Hong Kong was democratic in a Western style fashion. This was hypocrisy. How should Hong Kong try and proceed now? Now, I think a word of criticism here of the Chinese government and its handling of Hong Kong. I think that one country, two systems, which was a brilliant solution to the problem of Hong Kong, a civilization state solution to the problem. A nation state would never think of those terms in those terms. But what is one country, two systems? How do you create the balance between the two? The project in the longer run is clearly to create a more unified country. It's not to just keep the two places entirely separate. And I think one of the difficulties that China has had is that initially its reaction to the handover, remember this is 1997, this is China just turning outwards into the world. There was a lot of publicity questioning about how China will conduct itself as the force behind Hong Kong and so on. And so I think that China's natural instinct in that period, an understandable instinct, was to emphasize two systems. I mean, I remember when I lived in Hong Kong for 2.5 years, soon after the handover, and I remember being surprised that the only evidence, virtually, of any Chinese presence, visible presence in Hong Kong, was one Chinese flag flying over one of the buildings near the harbour. There was just no evidence. Essentially, there was not much change. It just carried on in the old form. And there were two big problems with this. One, the governance of Hong Kong is a colonial governance. It's set up in a colonial manner. It's a kind of executive. There's no political leadership. There's no political sense of direction set by a colonial administration, because that's not the job of a colonial administration. That would have been done back in London in those days. But basically the form of government has stayed more or less the same as it was previously. And the second problem is about the economy. Now, contrary to the way in which the British have historically liked to talk about Hong Kong as this dynamic, competitive economy, by and large, that is just rubbish. Hong Kong is a typical colonial economy. It is not a competitive economy. It's a monopolistic economy. It basically preferred or empowered the tycoons to run Hong Kong, to divide up the spoils between themselves, above all in the field of property where most of the money was made. So this is an oligopolistic and monopolistic economy. That had to be changed. That has to be changed. But unfortunately, not nearly enough change has taken place. So my criticism of the Chinese government, it needs to break the situation in Hong Kong, to allow Hong Kong to go forward. It needs to change those two situations, to have a different sort of administration and to have a different kind of economy, which is more open. Now, let me finish by saying, compare the fortunes of Hong Kong with Shenzhen. Deng Xiaoping deliberately suggested the idea of Shenzhen just over the border, a little fishing port, so it was close to Hong Kong and could model itself and learn some of Hong Kong's lessons. Now compare the situation of Hong Kong today with where Shenzhen today. Shenzhen has made absolutely electrifying progress. It is the technological centre probably of China. It is the second only to Silicon Valley in its technical competence and innovation. And Hong Kong? There's nothing like that in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has made zero, they talked about it, but it made zero progress in this direction. I think that the Hong Kong people should press the Chinese government for more rapid integration in China's own plans. So that Hong Kong, rather than just thinking of itself as apart from China, it needs to think of itself more in terms of being part of China. You know, the mentality of the people is we're different, we're not Chinese. Well, of course, for 155 years, they never learned anything about China. They speak Cantonese, sure, but they didn't know anything really about China. They were ignorant about the North. Their lines of vision were all westwards to Britain or the West or the United States later or Canada, etc., and never north to China.